Welcome to Shine Together, a podcast where Edmonton's brightest minds come together to share ideas, collaborate, and inspire. What makes a city great is its people, and this podcast is all about bringing them together. So let's dive into meaningful conversations and make our cities shine greater together.
Kanse everyone, I'm Dr. Omar Mohammad, and I'm running for mayor in the next municipal election here in Edmonton, Alberta. Welcome to Shine Together, an Edmonton podcast where one expert takes the host chair and one expert Edmontonian takes the guest chair. And I get to have the honor and privilege of witnessing, listening, learning, and growing alongside both of you. Our guest today is a passionate advocate for Indigenous engagement and community development. With over 30 years of experience driving meaningful change in Edmonton and across Western Canada, Robb Campre has worked closely with industry and government to align with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Call to Action. He has helped immensely to bridge gaps and build stronger partnerships. As Vice Chair of NiGiNan Housing Corporation, he plays a key role in projects like Ambrose Place, Belvedere House, and the most recently acquired Sands Hotel, which provides affordable housing and full wraparound services for vulnerable communities. His leadership in mental health, addictions, and homelessness has created lasting solutions that are being modeled in communities across the country. Robb, brother, it's an honor to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
And our host today is a renowned political scientist, author, and thought leader. He's the Secretary General of the Canadian-based NGO Kashmir Civitas and an Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs. Dr. Farhan Chak's extensive career includes work with the United Nations, the Canadian Parliament, TRT World, and Qatar University. Beyond academia and policy work, Dr. Chak is also the founder and director of Veritas Leadership Consultancy and an accomplished TEDx speaker and poet. Perhaps the most exciting for us today, Dr. Chak is also the host of The Civic Current, a podcast that explores governance, civic engagement, and leadership, making him the perfect voice to lead today's conversation. Thank you very much for being here, gentlemen. Let's shine brighter together. And Dr. Chak, the show is all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Omar. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to support you in your mayoral candidacy. The city could not want a better advocate for, especially for the less fortunate, and to make this city, as you said, the city shine again. Robb, it's an absolute honor. I've heard so much about you, to meet you and to speak with you before the show about the struggles and the learning that we can all benefit from the Indigenous community. It's just an honor to be here with you today. So I thank you for that. Thank you for coming and giving us your valuable time. We present you and we really feel that you're a role model for so many of us, having to struggle through all those challenges in your youth and to come out on top and to be that role model for so many others, not just the Indigenous community, to kind of share and then to share with them ways that we can escape the poverty cycle, the struggles and challenges that are facing our communities. And we want to say that we are here with you in full solidarity to kind of support you in that mission. And that's frankly why I believe that the podcast itself has taken shape, that we want to build partnerships and solidarities. And in line with that, we want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory. This is the sacred ancestral lands of the First Nations, the Métis, the Inuit. And we acknowledge the centuries of learning and the centuries of sophistication that is often not acknowledged. We acknowledge that first and foremost. So thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
And I suppose I want to kind of start, Robb, with listening to your story. It's a powerful story. It's a story in which so many of us can learn so much. And so I want to hear from you that your struggles from growing up in poverty, overcoming those challenges, being such a successful entrepreneur, having a successful sports career, right? And being such a strong advocate for your community. Talk to us about your challenges, how you overcame them, and what we can learn from that.
Sure. Yes, it's quite the background, I guess, where I came from as a urban Indigenous youth growing up. I wasn't really connected with my culture in a way that I am today. Through ceremony, through elders, through teachings, I was just an urban Indigenous youth growing up in Northeast Edmonton, single parent family, fixed income, extreme poverty, and the challenges that, many of our Indigenous youth face, with, housing, with, food shortage, no transportation. And so I had this one little thing as a kid growing up. I was addicted to sports. And this addiction, fed me into, playing all sorts of sports, from soccer to basketball to hockey to football. I eventually settled in on football because it's probably one of the cheaper sports to play, but I truly had a passion for football. And when I look back on, growing up, I used to go to the field by myself and kick the football in the field and just chase it down. I used to go run the hills in the morning time thinking, well, I'm going to play for the Edmonton Eskimos, when I get older. In order to do that, I need to train. And so I took my own training program. It wasn't even a program, just kind of like, I'm going to go run the hills in the morning and work out. I rode my bike everywhere because we didn't have a vehicle. And so I was kind of forced to either use the ETS bus or my bike. And in fact, my first year with the Eskimos, I went to rookie camp and then to main camp. I had to borrow my friend's football cleats to go to rookie camp with the Eskimos. And I had to ride my bike to practice every day because I'm not cashing those checks today. And so riding my bike to practice, I remember Coach Parker, our head coach, CFL legend Jackie Parker, he would offer to, give me a ride home in his car because it was raining after practice, stormy, and he's like, Rob, I'll give you a ride home.
Wow.
He saw where he dropped me off in Abbotsfield in the hood, and he's like, "This is where you live?" I'm like, "Yep, this is home." And so he got to get to know me a little bit over a period of time, and he gave me probably half a dozen rides home after practice over the years. And I remember him saying to me one time, he said, "Rob, do you know what the Edmonton Eskimo tradition is all about?" I'm like, "No, what is it?" And he said it's around 4 things. He goes, "If you do these 4 things in life, you're going to find success. Number 1, stay humble. Number 2, work hard. 3, surround yourself with people much more capable than you. And 4, give back to the community." Goes, that's the Edmonton Eskimo tradition.
And give back, I have to mention, and there's a nickname which precedes you, sir, and that's Banana Man.
Yes.
So back to give back. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about why you used to give bananas to people and how you got the nickname Banana Man?
Yeah. So, growing up in extreme poverty, my mom would have to go to the food bank, 2 or 3 times a month to feed the family. There's 7 kids in the family. So we always had to, ration the food or, go to the food bank. And so I really had a close to my heart relationship with the food bank because we survived on it as kids. And so when I got older and I have 2 boys of my own and they're, into sports, into hockey, both my boys have allergies to nuts. One has allergies to eggs. And so people bring cupcakes, they bring muffins and, nice little treats after games for kids when they're younger, which is great. Right. But they couldn't have them because of cross-contamination and allergies and such. So I thought, well, if someone brings a box of Timbits, it's like $5. Well, what if I picked up a bag of bananas? Give them some nutrition and something healthy. And so I'd go to the store before every game, practice, games, hockey, lacrosse, and I'd pick up a bag of bananas. And I just didn't want to give my son, here's a banana and the rest of the kids. So I just bought a bag of bananas, and it just became a thing. And so I ended up bringing bananas to every game, every practice, hockey, lacrosse for both my boys. And it was amazing because as the years progressed, I had some kids that played on my team or played on our team the one year, the next year they weren't. I'd bring extra bananas. Wow. And I'd see, because I knew we were playing against them. Right. And I'd give these kids that bananas, and their eyes just lit up. And they're so excited because they were like, well, we're not on your team anymore, but you're still giving us bananas. So it was a real kind of wholesome relationship and bonding, that I had with the kids of bringing bananas over that period of time. So I became the Banana Man because of my bringing bananas to hockey.
What I think is so brilliant about that is that this is far before the tendency nowadays for nutrition and to replace, the junk food that usually is being shared on the fields and the sports camps. You were far, and it was just intuitively you wanted to do good. Intuitively you wanted to share. And because of your circumstances, you also knew that you didn't want anyone to feel left out. Mm-hmm. And I think so many of us who grew up with those challenges, first generation, my father came here 1968, and Dr. Omar's father too, they struggled when they came here, struggled with acceptance. And one of the first families that we felt acceptance from were the Indigenous community. And it's interesting because my brother is married Indigenous, and I've grown up now around that. And it's such a loving, warm culture. And it's a culture that recognizes the sentiment of how other people are feeling. It doesn't try to stunt or shun you away from that very human feeling. Well, this person is without. Unfortunately, modern society kind of shields you from that. It wants to take away that feeling of how someone else is living in their shoes, where the Indigenous community embraces it in entirety. It wants you to be able to empathize with others, not only other people, the natural surroundings. Absolutely. Would you agree?
It's based in the whole foundation of this country. You look at the treaties that we have, 1 through 11. That relationship was around let's work together, coexist, and mutually benefit. And we've functioned and operated through that way for tens of thousands of years, but in most recent last 150 years through treaty. And we are still here saying we are going to be good partners and good friends of our newcomers that have come here to this day. So we haven't broken any treaty, but treaties have been broken against us.
And I think it's very important to underline, and Dr. Omar and I have spoken about this before, recognition from Canadians in general that who is the host in our shared space. Right. So there is this there's this argument that some members, to be honest, I just saw former Prime Minister Stephen Harper on this talk show in the US, and I broke down all the thinking of his that was, I would characterize as completely incorrect. And the first one was that his assumption that he is the host. So they are the owners of Canada and all of us are the immigrants. Well, the premise, the foundation starting point is wrong because it's the First Nations that are the First Nations, are the hosts of the country. And like you said, you haven't broken the treaties. The treaties have been broken against them. And still, irrespective of not breaking the treaties, it's the Indigenous communities that are seen as angry, as resentful, and this is paralleled in many other situations throughout the globe, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Kashmir, whether it's in other areas. You can see that the occupying or settler colonial states usually blame the original Indigenous host populations for the crimes that they themselves commit.
Right. And my understanding, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, and growing up, I learned more about Brazil and I learned more about the ozone layer than I did about our own past and history here. But my understanding on the treaties and who's actually managing the treaties is now the government of Canada. But the original deals were made with the Crown. So there's kind of like, is that correct? Is that kind of how it's going in terms of management?
Well, it's really kind of a forced occupation of a relationship of a mother and a father. So the Crown and the Indigenous people, this relationship that was consummated through this relationship called treaty. And the government, the federal government, they had to adopt these treaties in order to adopt the British North American Act, in order to adopt the parliamentary system from Britain. They had to adopt these treaties as part of that whole relationship because Britain at that time was colonizing countries around the world and they had to abide by international law. And as part of this international law were treaties formed and signed with the original people of the land, the Indigenous people. And when you look at the relationship of Canada, we, as the First Peoples, see the government of Canada as kind of our birth child of that relationship. And that consummated relationship gave the province, the municipalities, the existence to exist. And so that relationship is really, us, Indigenous people, as the land owners or the land stewards, and the Crown as kind of the fiduciary governance side of it. And this relationship that allows new people to come here is in relationship to these treaties that were formed and signed 150 years ago. And so we see these as the federal government as an agent of this relationship, not as the owner, as the agent. And their to uphold this relationship, to honor the crown, but also to the original people who signed this treaty.
Absolutely. Honor the original.
And so I don't see this as like when they say it's crown land, like, no, it's actually treaty land. Because it was signed as a treaty to allow these newcomers to come and settle on this land. Even the 5 inches, 6 inches of land, surface land, to allow these newcomers to plow was within that treaty. And so this relationship was very clearly defined. But, in time, the government had to relationship itself with the Indigenous people. And how they did it was they created this legislation called the Indian Act. And the Indian Act allowed the government to facilitate their legislative relationship of the original people. But how they saw it was now they turned into the paternalistic relationship and saying, we're going to be the parents, you're the heathens, you're uneducated, and you need our help. And so it put us in that position of wards of the state. And to this day, they still constitute us as wards of the state. And if you look at, the residential schools and now today, the byproduct of that, the child welfare system, they seen them as our saviors coming to rescue us from ourselves.
Right.
Even though we existed here for tens of thousands of years and we learned to, coexist and mutually benefit with each other, they had to come in and say, we need to take care of you.
That's right.
Okay, now what I see here, just being an Edmontonian and growing up here, being born here, you'll see that, a lot of homelessness. You'll see a lot of, certain types of populations in jail, and a lot of that is Indigenous. Compared to the population base, about 5% Indigenous here around in Edmonton, you see a lot more homelessness in terms of the Indigenous population. You see a lot more Indigenous people in jail, generally in the population. Do you think that some of our systems are not meeting the treaties and meeting what's been promised?
Well, the system's meeting the criteria, and when you look at Indigenous people in Alberta, we make up 6% of the population overall. First Nation, Métis, Inuit. The largest population base of that are non-status, which means they've been disenfranchised from the relationship of their home community, from their relationship to the land as a First Nation or a Métis or an Inuit person. They're non-status. So we make up 6% of the provincial population, yet incarceration rates for Indigenous people, 33% of male prisoners are Indigenous men. For women, it's over 80% of Indigenous women make up the female prison population in Alberta. The child welfare system, 70% plus of the child welfare caseloads are Indigenous families. And so there's such a overrepresentation in these institutionalized relationships. And so when you talk about, they're not hitting the mark on the treaty, but they're definitely hitting the mark on a feedstock that we feed an economy to keep this province, going. I don't even get into the tax credit and the disproportionate relationship of why there's an incentive to take our kids out of our family, because the province gets to benefit $1.8 billion a year as transfer payments from the federal government for taking care of those kids. And it's a premium if it's an Indigenous kid.
Right.
And so it's incentivized to take the kids away from the families.
It's tragic. And much more needs to be talked about this, I think, and we need to raise awareness continuously. And one of the things that I did when I was, I'm teaching a class at Grant MacEwan and at the University of Alberta on contemporary issues in political theory. And what we've done is that included scholars like Dr. Glenn Coutard and Dr. Leanne Simpson, just brilliant Indigenous scholars, to kind of share that with the young minds at the University of Alberta and MacEwan, to talk to them about so many misconceptions that they have and so many real grotesque injustices that have been done. And what you were talking about kind of brought it to mind that in Grandin Station, there used to be a mural. And the mural showed a pastor, Vitaly, I believe his name was, taking an Indigenous child away from an Indigenous mother.
I remember that.
And it was painted and it was celebrated. Now, imagine someone taking your child away from you, and imagine someone celebrating taking their child away from you. Just the entire concept of it, who would authorize that? It is something truly, I think, it's a very ugly idea that someone would celebrate that. And what I'm hearing is that it's an ongoing problem. This idea of taking Indigenous children away from their parents. So Rob, talk to us about that. Like, how do you explain that?
Well, it's that self-serving purpose, right? And that indoctrination of this relationship of, taking care of the Indigenous people and saving ourselves from ourselves. There's one of the, I think, prime ministers of Canada at one time said, got to kill the Indian, save the man. And we have to save them from themselves because they're heathens, they're uneducated. The doctrine of discovery is based on this relationship of the Pope saying, if you find land in a foreign country and it's a new land and it's occupied by heathens or uneducated people or non-religious people, you can take that land in the name of the Pope and call it the doctrine of discovery and claim that land is your land.
Oh.
That still exists today.
Right, the thinking that produces that absolutely thing. And we need to confront that together. We need to confront that injustice. And there's so many instances of that. You see some of those stereotypes and discriminations and that racism. We grew up kind of witnessing that as well. I've always found the irony. I want to kind of share this with you. I want to see what your thoughts are. Like, I grew up in a neighborhood called Sakhaw. So this is it's an Indigenous name. And next to us was Mayakumin and another one was Manissa. So in Mill Woods in Southside Edmonton, the communities were named Indigenous names. I remember in grade 6 that all the students in our class got together. There was not one Indigenous child in our class, and we had to make a totem pole. And so each one of us was carving a part of this totem pole while majority of the kids were laughing at it and making fun of it and laughing at the culture. And I remember thinking how cold and how inappropriate, that instinctively I felt that it was cold and inappropriate what so many of the young children were doing. But that's learned behavior.
Absolutely. And I'll have to say we have to change the narrative. Absolutely. When I grew up, we played the game called Cowboys and Indians.
Yeah.
It was a very common game, and nobody, just to be frank, nobody wanted to be the Indian because, you wanted to be the cowboy. And then we didn't understand as kids what's actually going on. We were just born here. This is where our souls were. And I didn't have a lot of Indigenous people as friends growing up. So, culture and understanding and to actually where you're from was really missed a lot growing up. And you start discovering things when you get a little older and start looking at stuff. So absolutely making that point about that. You're making a totem pole without any context, right? And
absolutely,
and I think we might have had a very similar, where we both in Edmonton had a very similar education system. So,
right,
I think in order to look at things and have some understanding, we have to first have the discussion and be real with what's actually going on.
And don't misrepresent the community that you're learning from. And I think this is what's also so important about having podcasts and writing books and what the scholars are doing in the Indigenous community and what we can do as allies to support that, because we face similar struggles in the same regard. But to kind of highlight the achievements, and we were talking about it before the show, I'd like to bring it back that the Six Nations peace that was established in Canada for over 200 years was the basis of so many of the democratic principles that became enshrined in the Canadian Constitution. But we're not teaching it. We're not showing even our young Indigenous boys and girls that you have a great legacy of cooperation, of stewardship, of respect and embracing diversity and individuality and community to make them feel a sense of pride about their own community, but also to share that with everyone. I don't think we're doing it enough. We need to raise awareness about this.
Well, when you look at the wampum belt, that was a sacred treaty relationship that we had, and it's the law of the land. It's that natural law, not this facilitated, man-made constitutional construct of a law of a person's perspective versus a natural law perspective. When you look at the Iroquois Confederacy law in the States, United States of America, their whole constitution is based on the Iroquois Confederacy law. So they are the hegemonic superpower of the world, but their law is rooted to the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, which is so powerful when you look at the relationship of what it's become today. It's rooted and based on our laws, our
Right.
natural laws of coexisting, mutually benefiting, supporting each other, having that freedom of identity, having that freedom of travel and existence, and the interdependence and interdependence of relationship that we have. Like, it's the basis
It is the
of
basis.
we have in this place we call Turtle Island.
That's
That
right.
I don't see differences between my brothers and sisters down in Florida, the Seminoles, or the Dene people of the North. Like, we are Indigenous people to this land, and
Absolutely.
we're rooted to the same relationship of the land is the one who defines us. We don't ever define the land, and the natural laws of relationship that exist that we don't have any constructs of. It is what it is because of this natural relationship of the Creator providing, existing, and allowing us to coexist with the trees, the rocks, the water, the mountains, with each other, with the animals, the four-legged creatures. We get to coexist and mutually benefit from each other. It's
Absolutely.
powerful.
It's very powerful.
Very powerful. And I'm a big hiker, as I've mentioned in some of our discussions with you. And I feel that, when I'm out hiking out in the woods, and you feel, and you're with your Creator, and you're out there, you feel that how important the land is, and the harmony of the land, and everything like that. And I feel we miss that as a society. Maybe we miss that in an urban environment, and we're in our ruts, and we're working, and we're going. But yeah, when you say things like that, that hits home for me, brother. So
Absolutely. It hits home. And I think what you touched on kind of brings us to one of the key insights of the Indigenous culture is the stewardship versus extractivism. And I want to just give a quote here by Dr. Leanne, and she critiques extractivism, and she describes it as a non-reciprocal, dominance-based relationship with the earth, one of profound taking. It's the opposite of stewardship, the idea that the Indigenous community celebrated and championed, which involves taking, but also taking care of that regeneration and the future life to come. So in essence, a very long-term thinking, a very long-term strategic relationship with your natural surroundings.
But it's also that balance of, extracting, but in a stewardship way. For instance, I come from the Fort McKay First Nation,
Right.
and we have industry in abundance all around us. And it's probably the driver of the Alberta economy, if not the Canadian economy, in many different ways. And so they used to take off this overburden, and they used to stockpile it and then go get and do the mining on the oil sand or the bitumen. But our elders, over a period of time, saw what they're doing when they're trying to restore the land back to, after they finish their mining, restore it, put it back in as land or as fill. They had to bring in non-Indigenous trees. And so what our elders said was, and they worked with the oil companies, said, you take off that top surface, all that biodiversity, store it separately from all the underneath that biodiversity.
Wow.
And let it flourish and let it survive and let it exist. And then when you're ready to put that topsoil back on, you put that biodiversity back on top. And you get that relationship back sooner to how it was. And so there's ways that we can do things, but we can work together, and utilizing an Indigenous knowledge, perspective, relationship to this land that goes back tens of thousands of years, that doesn't compromise. It allows us to exist and benefit from the resources that we have been blessed with.
Right.
But yet, utilize it in a way that's going to leave a legacy in a positive way for the next generation.
Absolutely. A sustainable relationship that recognizes the worth and the value. Such a beautiful insight that use that biomass, remove it, but bring it back when you're done. And then you can regenerate the earth so much quicker. It's such a beautiful insight. Absolutely. I think, in what other ways do you think we could share this? As an academic, I always try to include it in my classes. I want our young, many of whom don't know. And I want to create that safe space in the classroom, because that's where we're changing hearts and minds. And I want them to be able to understand and perceive what it's like. Imagine living in your own home and being ridiculed for your ways of knowing and your culture. And worst of all, it being misrepresented. What other ways do you think that we could support you in getting the accurate information about the beauty of the Indigenous culture out there?
Well, it goes back to this old saying, change only comes from within and never from without. And so if we want to see real meaningful change, you have to change on the inside. And you have to be able to influence and show that this culture that we have in this country, that's the original culture, is rich and vibrant and amazing, just like all cultures.
Absolutely.
But when we come together and we share and we acknowledge and we get to participate, you get a better understanding of why it's rooted, to why it's celebrated, why it's acknowledged. I grew up as an urban Indigenous youth. I've been called by an old professor at university phenotypically ambivalent. So I can blend in with the white world and the red world. So I can blend in both sides.
Right.
But as a kid growing up, I was too red for the white kids and too white for the red kids. And I was like lost in this no man's land.
Right.
But I've taken that negative and I turn it into positive, because today I'm able to go into meetings with Indigenous people and I blend. I'm able to go into meetings with white people and I blend and I get accepted, because I've been able to facilitate that relationship of challenges and difficulties as a very young youth that now has aided my benefit to navigate and network in this world that's kind of connected but not connected. And so if we want to really, change the narrative, we need to make the space safe. And we have to acknowledge, the elephant in the room. And, I grew up, my mother didn't really, say, Rob, you should go to school and get your education.
Right.
Because her experience in the school system was in the residential schools. She was beaten. She was raped. She has a lot of trauma that's been passed on to me as a second generation of her as a residential school survivor. And when you just even say that, imagine having to say a residential school survivor.
Yeah.
Like, you don't say a graduate.
Right.
You're saying,
Survivor.
we survived.
Yeah.
And so that generational trauma that existed through my mother and passed on to me and my siblings is in our community. And so when we go to these institutions, we don't feel safe. We don't feel acknowledged. We don't feel this relationship of, well, I'm coming here to, get an education so I can benefit back into my community. It's stigmatized.
Right.
Our Indigenous students, when they come in from northern communities, they come into the city, they can't even rent an apartment. Why? Because they're stigmatized. And that whole generational trauma is inside them, and they see it and they feel it. And you don't have to talk about it, but you can feel it. And so if we want to create change, change only comes from within and never from without. So schools, institutions, they should start to incorporate the real history of Canada, the story, the narrative of the wonderfulness of our community and our relationship to the land and to each other, and how we survived for tens of thousands of years in this unhospitable climate.
That's right.
We did it.
You did
Absolutely.
it. And, back to that, talking about trauma and, generational trauma. And, from what I know and understanding, talking to researchers and that sort of thing, trauma feeds into poverty. Trauma feeds into homelessness. Trauma feeds into crime. Trauma feeds into these things, if you look at it from a research based. And, and so, from change from within, your name precedes you in another way in talking to researchers. And I've talked to researchers involved in homelessness and combating that. And you're one of those guys that has come across as doing it right. Okay. And you've taken me to one of your projects in NiGiNan housing. And I can't pronounce the name. I think it's termed Belvedere House, and I did that in your introduction.
Yes, Oimagagukumik.
Very good. I will learn that. I promise you I will learn that. I will do my best in the spirit of learning.
Solidarity,
And
yes.
solidarity. But tell us a little bit about your initiatives that way from within, and you being able to bridge gaps, being, fitting in with the white man, as you say, and with Indigenous communities. And you're one of those guys that comes across, and your name has come across as the guy doing it right. And me running for mayor of Edmonton, trying to learn from you and being and strongly advocating for these sort of initiatives. Please tell me how we could help you in this regard.
Well, it goes back to, it's not me as doing it right, it's the team. And I mentioned earlier, which Coach Jackie Parker said, Rob, surround yourself with people much more capable than you.
Right.
That's the secret. I can't do this by myself. I'm part of it, but it takes a whole team. It takes a whole community. And so I have a very, very strong team of much smarter people than me. They're doing it right. And I get to participate in that as a participant in their efforts and our shared efforts to create change. And so with the relationship of NiGiNan Housing Corp, we celebrate our 10-year anniversary last November. We started off with Ambrose Place, and now we have 4 buildings, and we just got funding for a 5th place, which will be at Ambrose Place 2. We are starting to create that space of living in a city that has the largest urban Indigenous population base in Canada. Winnipeg per capita has larger per capita, but their city's smaller, their population's smaller. We have the largest urban Indigenous population base in Canada. Within 1 hour's drive, we have 100,000 Indigenous people. We service the northern BC, the northern Alberta, Saskatchewan, the territories. When they want to get out of their communities and they want to go to a big city, Edmonton's their go-to.
Wow.
It's that relationship that exists, going back to the fur trade. This was the place to come to be to create change.
Right on.
And so when you look at, the relationship of Indigenous people in the city, it goes back, tens of thousands of years. But, historically in the last 150 years, Edmonton is the go-to place in Canada for Indigenous people.
Right on. Very good.
That's fantastic. Rob, honestly, I've learned so much. And again, we are so proud of your achievements and your work. And we do really want to know, in whatever way or capacity, that we could support your initiatives. I'll be teaching again in May at both the University of Alberta and at Grant MacEwan. I would love for you to come to class and speak to the students direct firsthand. As a matter of fact, I had sent a message to Dr. Leanne Simpson, and because I was just so amazed by her work, and I just reached out to her. I said, look, I'm a professor here at the University of Alberta, and I would love for you to come, even Zoom or in person if you could, and speak to the students. And she got back to me, and she said, look, this semester is really tight, but definitely in the future, I would be honored to come. But you're here. And I want young Canadians in the universities that may have witnessed some of the systemic discrimination, have seen it, and have definitely been a victim of a lot of misinformation, because when they open up with me, I can hear it and how they speak about the Indigenous communities. And for you to be there, I think would be a game changer. I think if they were to see you, how articulate you are, and the challenges, and even the story of the banana man, but to contextualize it, and you gave, and you wanted it, you had that sympathy. There has been so much dehumanization of the Indigenous community. We need to go back and remind, almost, unfortunately, but that's the situation. We have to step back and say, excuse me, this is an extremely humane, generous community, and I hope you'll take me up on that offer.
I will, and I won't speak to your students, but I'll engage with your students.
Absolutely.
Because I feel that when they speak and they ask those questions, they will really start to flesh out, their inquiries about what it is. It's like that Indigenous 101, right? You get to engage in a reciprocal way where I'm not going to speak to them. I will speak with us as a group and let comes out organically and facilitate in a way. When you mentioned earlier about the internal mechanism of the history and the colonization and the education system, and there's no real stories of grandeur or acceptance or understanding of Indigenous people other than they're here,
Yes.
And we just kind of like two ships passing in the night, but there's no real kind of like, acknowledgement of, the real history. And I'll share a little story of the history of Canada that is still the basis of its functionality today. So we as First Nations, when we signed treaty with the Crown, with Queen Victoria, she, to honor her royal subjects, the First Nations assigning treaty, said, I'm going to put a $5 million endowment fund so you can ride that train in perpetuity to go travel to Ottawa to conduct your nation business.
Right.
And so that was a set aside that was going to be held in trust for us as First Nations to travel across this land. Well, we have this forming of Canada. We have the existence of this relationship of sovereignty. And there's two things that define sovereignty: infrastructure and citizenship.
Right.
And so Canada was being encroached by the Cascade states in the Northwest. They're going to come up and they wanted Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC to tap into their territory up in Alaska to kind of save off and protect, the whole passage. They're looking at, that relationship of land as their own. And so Canada had to show infrastructure. And how it did that was it had to build a railroad. It negotiated with the Northwest Passage, Hudson Bay. It got access to this land, and it formed this Dominion of Canada as we know it today. Well, that $5 million was utilized to build the railroad and complete the railroad. Why? And that whole building of the railroad, Canada was a bankrupt country. It didn't have any taxations. It didn't have any revenues. It borrowed its money from the crown. And so in order for it to get that completion of that railroad, it saw that $5 million trust account held in trust for the First Nations to ride the rail in perpetuity and went, we got to finish this railroad.
Wow.
We're going to declare a national state of emergency. We're going to second that money, that First Nations money,
Right.
and we're going to use it for our capital infrastructure so we can build the Dominion of Canada as we know it today. That little game of taking our money still exists today. In the treaties, it says 4% of land resources sold or extracted gets paid to First Nations in a trust. Well, because we're the wards of the state at that time, and they kind of still see it that way today, they feel the crown or the government of Canada goes, well, we have legislated our relationship. We see them as like the wards of us, so we got to take care of them. And they've been they've been accumulating this money in a trust. And that 4% is in a trust fund somewhere in Ottawa in a tune of about $2.3 trillion.
Wow.
That's entrusted to us.
Wow.
It collects about $38 billion a year in interest. Well, when Canada needs a capital infrastructure injection of money to build infrastructure across Canada, guess where it taps into?
Wow.
The Indigenous funds.
Our funds.
Absolutely.
So when you talk about, who's living off who?
Who's living off
Off
who?
the land, off the money, off the promise.
That is,
And that's
what
why
you see.
it's such
Yeah.
a kept secret. We got to keep these guys, on their little reserves
that's right.
and keep them out of sight, out of mind, while we just do our own business here and take advantage of this relationship that we call treaty.
Wow. Well,
Right.
in the nature of, what I hoped this show would bring and bringing people that I know together and to collaborate and discuss. I can say just watching you two, I think that's mission accomplished for this. And
Absolutely.
I hope we continue this discussion. But I think that's all the time we have for today. It's time to shine Edmonton. Let's shine brighter together.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Rob,
Yes.
and thank you,
Hi, hi.
Dr. Chak. And I look forward to talking with you guys soon.
Hi,
Fantastic.
Exemaga.
Hi, hi.
Hey, that was awesome.
Man, Rob, you're full
I
of
learned.
information.
I learned a lot, my friend. And
That's just
was our
a
very
little
first
bit of,
and that's just a little bit.
you talk
Right.
about the Grandin Station and that whole.
That pissed me
mural.
off.
So when I was going to university, I lived
Time has come.
Yeah.
The time is now. It's time. It's time to shine.
It's time to shine, Edmonton, let's shine together. Let's all shine bright in all kinds of weather. Time to shine, Edmonton, let's shine together. Let's all shine bright in all kinds of weather. What time to shine, Edmonton, let's shine together.